Hi guys, I hope you are doing well tonight. Before we begin, I'm curious, where are you listening to this story from, and what time is it for you right now? It's always fascinating to imagine someone in a quiet room, maybe late at night, hearing this story from across the world. Tonight, we're going to take a slow walk into the life of an ordinary German soldier during the Second World War, to understand what it was like, not just in battles or campaigns, but in all the small, often overlooked moments that made up the reality of everyday life at that time. From what they ate, to how they spent their rare moments of rest, to the sounds and smells that surrounded them, and even the rumors they whispered to each other in the darkness of the trenches, it all contributed to a life that was far more complex than simply marching and fighting. Life as a soldier was rarely what one might imagine from movies or stories told after the fact. For the men in the ranks, the war was as much about endurance, boredom, and small rituals as it was about strategy or heroism. The days were long and often monotonous, yet never entirely predictable. One morning, a soldier might wake up to the familiar creak of wooden floors in a barracks somewhere deep in occupied territory, to the smell of damp wool uniforms drying on lines stretched across the room, and the faint aroma of coffee brewing somewhere in the mess hall. The taste of that coffee could vary drastically depending on where they were stationed, sometimes bitter and thin, made from roasted acorns or barley if proper beans were unavailable, and other times strong, dark, almost comforting in its familiarity. Breakfast often consisted of black bread, sometimes with a thin layer of margarine or cheese if supplies allowed, and occasionally a small portion of cold sausage. Nothing luxurious, but enough to keep the men moving, enough to keep them alert, or at least awake, during drills or marches that could stretch for hours without any noticeable change in scenery. Evenings could be quiet, but never completely peaceful. Some soldiers would write letters home, carefully crafting words that might convey hope without admitting too much fear, hoping their loved ones wouldn't sense the strain of the uniform on their body or mind. Others played simple card games in small clusters, leaning against the wooden walls of makeshift shelters, listening for the occasional distant crack of gunfire or the sudden whistle of a passing plane. Conversations drifted from memories of home to rumors of what was happening on other fronts, stories of comrades who had been reassigned, wounded, or worse, often blending fact and exaggeration until no one could tell what was real and what was simply the fog of wartime imagination. Occasionally, a soldier might dare to sing, quietly, a song from before the war, just enough to hear the tune over the background noise of creaking boots or clinking mess tins. The routine of a soldier's day was punctuated by small surprises, some pleasant, some unnerving. Supply trucks could bring fresh bread or cans of preserved meat, a brief comfort that made men almost forget the omnipresent tension of patrolling and sentry duty. At other times, orders arrived that disrupted the most carefully calculated day. Marches into unknown territory, long periods spent digging trenches or repairing fortifications, or sudden shifts into combat positions with barely enough notice to grab a few personal items. Soldiers learned quickly to carry their belongings in a way that allowed them to move with minimal effort, often wrapping necessities in cloth or tucking them into pockets and pouches that had seen years of wear. There was a constant balancing act between maintaining readiness and preserving energy, between staying alert to the threat of enemy forces and finding tiny moments of normalcy that reminded them they were still human. Meals themselves could become social events in a way that one might not expect. Men would huddle together, passing what little they had, sharing cans of soup or chunks of bread, sometimes trading small luxuries like chocolate or cigarettes that had been smuggled from home or obtained through rare supply runs. The stories exchanged at these times were a mix of superstition, camaraderie, and humor, dark humor, often a way to cope with the constant stress. It was not uncommon to hear exaggerated tales of encounters with strange animals in the forests they marched through, or ghost stories whispered around a dim lantern, the shadows of tents flickering against the canvas walls as if the figures themselves were listening. In this way, the soldiers built a small world within the larger chaos, a microcosm of normality where laughter and fear coexisted in a delicate balance. Even the smallest tasks carried weight. Cleaning a rifle, polishing boots, maintaining the uniform, all these acts were more than just preparation for combat. They were rituals that gave structure to a life that could otherwise feel entirely unpredictable. Letters might arrive from home, bringing fleeting comfort or sudden anxiety, while orders from superiors could arrive simultaneously, demanding immediate action or long, grueling hours of waiting in damp conditions. Every day was a negotiation between patience and urgency, between the hope of survival and the awareness of danger that never fully disappeared, even during moments of rest. And so, life flowed in a rhythm that was at once monotonous and unpredictable, dangerous yet strangely mundane, a paradox that defined the ordinary experience of the German soldier during those years. Their world was filled with small victories and minor tragedies, fleeting moments of warmth and comfort, punctuated by the harshness of orders, the coldness of the environment, and the ever-present tension of knowing that every choice could carry consequences far beyond the immediate moment. It was a life of endurance, adaptation, and constant negotiation with forces both seen and unseen, within the body, the mind, and the external world shaped by war. The mornings did not always begin with the sounds of bells or strict orders. Sometimes, they began with the quiet rustle of leaves outside a temporary camp or the distant barking of dogs from nearby villages, reminding the men that life, in some form, continued beyond the borders of their encampment. The air carried the scent of damp earth and smoke from cooking fires, and sometimes, for a fleeting moment, the smell of home seemed to blend with the smell of war, creating a disorienting mixture of comfort and tension. Soldiers moved slowly at first, shaking off the stiffness of sleeping on the hard ground or in narrow wooden bunks, stretching muscles that had been unused or overworked, while the mind gradually adjusted to the day ahead, preparing for tasks that might range from patrolling a quiet field to constructing barricades under the ever-present possibility of enemy engagement. Food remained both a necessity and a source of unexpected camaraderie. Even the simplest meals, such as a bowl of watery soup or coarse bread, became moments of connection. Men would sit together, sharing stories of their families, speculating about news they had heard from the front lines, or comparing small comforts like who had received a piece of chocolate or a better ration of sausage. When fresh vegetables or meat arrived, the excitement was subtle yet palpable. Hands would tremble slightly as men carefully portioned out the food, reluctant to waste even a crumb, and yet there was laughter too, often quiet, almost conspiratorial, as they joked about the scarcity of delicacies they had once taken for granted. In some camps, a soldier with a small skill in cooking could elevate a mundane meal into something extraordinary, using herbs scavenged from nearby forests or clever combinations of ingredients to provide not just nourishment, but a brief reminder of life before the conflict. Even the downtime was not free from tension or observation. Soldiers often engaged in small competitions, testing marksmanship with rifles unloaded, racing each other on muddy paths, or playing improvised games that required strategy and coordination. These activities, though seemingly trivial, were crucial for maintaining mental sharpness and social cohesion, allowing the men to retain a sense of purpose and identity beyond the uniform and the rigid hierarchy of military life. At night, quiet conversations would emerge in the dim glow of lanterns as men exchanged secrets, fears, and hopes in whispers, aware that even the darkness could conceal dangers from both the environment and the unpredictable circumstances of war. Letters remained a lifeline, even when they arrived months late or in damaged condition. The careful cursive of a loved one's handwriting could ignite a flood of memory, or the smell of familiar paper could transport a soldier to a home far removed from mud, frost, or the smell of gunpowder. Some men kept small photographs tucked in their uniforms, hidden under layers of fabric, while others carried trinkets, pieces of jewelry, a pressed flower, or a small carved figure that reminded them of family and friends. These items, though small, became sacred in their own way, imbued with the hope that life outside the uniform would endure despite the surrounding chaos. Occasionally, rumors drifted through the ranks, some plausible, some clearly exaggerated. Tales of victories in distant cities, of comrades performing extraordinary feats, or of strange encounters with local populations were discussed over the clinking of tin cups and the rustle of maps and papers. Sometimes these stories brought hope, other times they brought anxiety, as the unknown could be both a comfort and a threat. Soldiers learned to filter these narratives carefully, weighing what might be true against what was wishful thinking, all the while recognizing that the stories themselves provided a form of mental sustenance, a way to occupy restless minds when the monotony of waiting threatened to overwhelm them. Physical routines were relentless, yet interspersed with moments of almost meditative repetition. Cleaning weapons, maintaining boots, adjusting uniforms, and packing gear required focus and precision, but also offered a rhythm that could be strangely soothing. The repetitive motions, combined with the predictability of small tasks, allowed soldiers to find fleeting moments of mental clarity, to feel a small measure of control over a world otherwise dominated by uncertainty. Even standing guard, listening to the subtle sounds of night, the creak of wood, the distant howl of animals, the occasional shout or whistle, became part of an unspoken dance, where every sense was alert yet every moment stretched into a quiet awareness of one's own presence in the vast expanse of the war-torn landscape. Rest, when it came, was often fragmented and fragile. Sleeping in tents or dugouts meant contending with cold, dampness, and the constant vigilance required to remain safe. Dreams could be brief and unsettling, mingling fragments of memories from home with imagined scenarios of battle, a mixture of longing and fear that left men waking suddenly, breathless or disoriented. Yet even in these moments, there was a strange beauty, a reminder that life, in its quietest forms, persisted despite the harshness of circumstance. Men learned to cherish these moments, fleeting as they were, finding comfort in the simple act of closing their eyes, of letting the mind wander, of imagining the scent of fresh bread or the warmth of a fire, however temporarily. The war also fostered a strange kind of creativity. Soldiers would carve small figures from wood, stitch simple designs onto fabric, or invent minor games to pass the hours. These acts were not merely distractions. They were affirmations of human resilience, small assertions of individuality in a world determined to suppress it. Humor, too, played an essential role, sometimes dark, sometimes absurd, always a coping mechanism. Jokes about improbable victories, unlikely encounters, or the quirks of daily military life circulated quietly, building bonds that were as necessary as any ration or weapon. It was in these moments of creativity and levity, often unnoticed by outsiders, that the soul of the ordinary soldier revealed itself, resilient and persistent, even amidst the destruction surrounding him. The afternoons often brought a shift in pace, a subtle change in energy that soldiers learned to anticipate without knowing precisely why. Sometimes the sun would break through clouds, warming the fields and casting long shadows across the uneven terrain, and men would find themselves squinting against the light as they performed routine tasks. Other times, rain would fall in sheets, soaking uniforms and turning paths into a slippery maze of mud, forcing soldiers to slow their steps and focus on each movement, aware that a misstep could mean injury or worse. Even these moments, though physically taxing, carried a strange sense of rhythm, as if the environment itself dictated a tempo to which all must conform. Supply lines were always a source of both relief and anxiety. The arrival of trucks or wagons, creaking under the weight of provisions, was anticipated with a mixture of excitement and suspicion. Food supplies could vary dramatically. Tins of preserved meat, often overcooked or strangely flavored, could appear alongside sacks of potatoes, sometimes sprouting tiny shoots, a reminder of the passage of time and scarcity. Fresh bread was a rare delight, sometimes arriving still warm, evoking a quiet cheer among the men, who would carefully break it apart, passing pieces to comrades nearby, mindful that generosity fostered camaraderie, but waste could be a silent offense in the disciplined order of camp life. In these moments, small rituals developed. Quiet ways to divide rations fairly, ways to hide a portion for later, or to share a treat with a friend who had been on sentry duty for hours. Conversation often shifted seamlessly between humor, speculation, and philosophical reflection. Soldiers would debate the meaning of small victories, the plausibility of rumors, or the oddities of local customs, sometimes pausing to watch a bird dart between trees or a distant village smoke curling into the sky. Laughter could erupt unexpectedly, a brief and fragile reprieve from tension, yet it was always tinged with an awareness of fragility. The juxtaposition of playfulness and anxiety became a defining element of life, a constant balancing act between acknowledging fear and asserting resilience. The sounds around the camp were never static. Birds chirped, dogs barked, and distant engines hummed, while closer at hand, the clatter of metal, the shuffle of boots, and the low murmurs of conversation created a layered symphony of ordinary life. Even the quietest moments were permeated by subtle tension, a faint anticipation that something might occur, a sudden inspection, a call to arms, or simply the arrival of news from another unit that could shift plans entirely. Soldiers adapted to this constant undercurrent, learning to live simultaneously in the present and in a state of readiness, their awareness stretching across minutes, hours, and days in a fluid continuum. Food preparation itself was a performance of patience and improvisation. When fresh meat was scarce, men learned to make do with dried or salted provisions, often boiling them in large pots over open flames, stirring cautiously to prevent scorching. Sometimes, herbs and wild greens gathered from nearby fields added a hint of freshness, and occasionally, someone with skill or experience could transform these ingredients into a meal that reminded men of home, even if only faintly. The preparation of coffee, often the centerpiece of small breaks, could be an art form in its own right, requiring careful attention to timing and technique, yet producing a bitter but comforting brew that encouraged conversation and reflection. The mental landscape was as demanding as the physical one. Soldiers constantly assessed risk, monitored the behavior of comrades, and measured their own endurance against the unpredictability of the environment. Letters from home offered fleeting solace but could also trigger worry or longing, while rumors from other units carried the double weight of curiosity and fear. Some men turned to small religious rituals, reciting brief prayers or meditative chants, seeking comfort in routine and tradition, while others relied on silent reflection, quietly recounting memories of past events, of landscapes and routines now removed from the immediacy of war. Evenings were often marked by subtle ceremonies of reflection and preparation. Men would organize their gear for the next day, inspecting weapons, mending uniforms, or checking rations with a meticulousness born from necessity. Lanterns were lit, casting flickering shadows across tents and barracks, illuminating faces lined with fatigue and thought. Conversations shifted toward quiet speculation about the future, both near and distant, as soldiers pondered the outcome of battles, the movements of allied and enemy forces, and the probability of returning home. Music, when it could be coaxed from an instrument or improvised with found objects, provided a fleeting escape, filling the night air with sound that seemed to contradict the silence and stillness of the world around them. Even in the absence of direct combat, fear and vigilance were constant companions. A sudden noise in the darkness, a snapping branch, a distant shout, the hiss of an animal, could jolt a man upright, heart racing, only to discover that it was nothing more than a trick of the senses. Sleep, when it came, was light and intermittent, punctuated by vivid dreams that merged memory and imagination, home and battlefield, comfort and dread. Soldiers learned to find rest in brief intervals, to make the most of small windows of calm, and to use these moments to recharge both body and mind for the tasks and uncertainties that awaited. In quieter moments, soldiers found ways to assert a sense of normalcy. Simple games of dice or cards, small bets, or storytelling sessions became rituals that maintained social cohesion and allowed for mental escape. Humor played a critical role in these activities, often dark, ironic, or absurd, providing a counterbalance to the oppressive circumstances of life under constant threat. These rituals were as essential to survival as any ration or piece of equipment, fostering bonds that were tested repeatedly, yet often endured because of their subtle, unspoken value. Days blended into one another in ways that could feel both endless and fleeting. The hours were marked by small rhythms, the steady passage of time measured not by clocks, which were often scarce or unreliable, but by the rising and setting of the sun, the patterns of guard rotations, and the slow, inevitable changes in the weather. Soldiers became intimately familiar with these rhythms, learning to anticipate the moments of quiet, the sudden bursts of activity, and the rare instances when chance or circumstance offered a brief respite from routine. The monotony itself was both a challenge and a form of comfort, a predictable structure that could be relied upon even when the world around them seemed chaotic. Weather shaped much of daily life. Rain could turn roads into rivers of mud, soaking boots and uniforms and forcing men to huddle together in tents or under makeshift shelters, while wind could whip through open fields, carrying dust, leaves, and the faint scent of smoke from distant fires. Soldiers learned to dress in layers, to adapt their movements to the elements, and to find small ways to preserve warmth and comfort whenever possible. Cold evenings were spent close to fires when available, or tucked into blankets and coats, sometimes sharing body heat in the cramped spaces of dugouts or barracks, and always aware that exposure could quickly sap strength and morale. Meals continued to serve as markers of both time and social connection. When supplies arrived, no matter how meager, they were carefully rationed, often divided according to rank, duty, or seniority, yet informal sharing was common, a quiet acknowledgement of the importance of solidarity. Soldiers experimented with combining ingredients, boiling tough meat until tender, or mixing dried vegetables and grains into soups that, while far from gourmet, offered sustenance and a brief sense of achievement. Coffee remained a prized commodity, brewed carefully, sometimes enhanced with sugar when available, creating a ritualistic moment in the otherwise unremarkable flow of the day. Work was unceasing, though it varied in intensity and purpose. Tasks ranged from constructing or repairing fortifications, maintaining vehicles and equipment, and digging trenches, to performing administrative duties or standing watch. Even the most mundane jobs carried importance, and soldiers were acutely aware that failure, negligence, or oversight could have immediate and severe consequences. Yet within this structured labor, men found ways to assert creativity or personal expression, carving initials into wooden beams, doodling on scraps of paper, or devising small improvements to the organization of supplies or sleeping arrangements. These acts, seemingly insignificant, provided a psychological anchor, a way to maintain identity and autonomy within a rigid system. Letters and communication with the outside world remained lifelines, though they were often delayed, censored, or lost. When a letter did arrive, it could transform an entire day, bringing tears, laughter, or quiet reflection. Soldiers read and reread words from loved ones, memorizing phrases, imagining faces, and mentally reconstructing the scenes described. Some preserved the letters meticulously, tucking them into uniform pockets or wooden boxes, while others carried small tokens from home, buttons, scraps of fabric, photographs, objects imbued with emotional weight far beyond their material value. Evenings offered opportunities for reflection and subtle indulgence. Soldiers would gather in small groups, sometimes sharing songs or stories, other times sitting in silence, listening to the distant hum of activity or the natural sounds that permeated the camp. The flicker of lanterns or the glow of a fire illuminated faces lined with fatigue, thought, or quiet amusement, casting shadows that seemed to move independently, as if observing the living in their transient moments of vulnerability. Discussions often meandered, ranging from tactical speculation to childhood memories, philosophical debates about morality, or imagined scenarios of life after the war. These conversations reinforced bonds, maintained morale, and offered mental escape, all while never fully dissolving the awareness of danger. Boredom, surprisingly, became both a challenge and a tool for survival. Soldiers developed ways to occupy their minds, reciting poems or prayers, creating games with sticks and stones, or engaging in quiet competitions of skill or endurance. Humor, often subtle and ironic, provided relief from the tension, while camaraderie served as a buffer against isolation. Even in moments of enforced stillness, men were learning, observing, and strategizing, mentally preparing for situations that could arise at any moment, whether it was a sudden inspection, a change in orders, or the approach of an enemy unit. Health and hygiene were constant concerns, though resources were limited. Soldiers washed and cleaned when possible, tended to minor wounds, and improvised solutions to discomforts caused by lice, blisters, or frostbite. Simple acts of care, polishing boots, mending uniforms, or tending to a small injury, were imbued with more than practical importance. They became symbols of persistence and resistance against the harshness of circumstance. Even small victories in maintaining cleanliness or comfort could boost morale, reminding men that they retained some control over their environment and their bodies, however constrained it might be. The psychological landscape was as demanding as the physical one. Soldiers contended with fear, fatigue, and longing simultaneously, managing emotions that could swing unpredictably from laughter to anxiety, from hope to despair. Dreams of home, memories of family, and imagined futures mingled with immediate concerns, creating an internal environment as complex and unpredictable as the terrain outside the camp. Many developed personal rituals or superstitions, carrying charms, repeating certain phrases, or following idiosyncratic routines, all in an effort to exert influence over the uncontrollable variables of life at war. Even mundane moments carried unexpected intensity. Watching the sky change as clouds gathered, observing the movement of birds or animals, or listening to distant echoes of human activity could spark reflection, curiosity, or unease. Men learned to read subtle cues in their environment, from the smell of smoke to the sound of approaching vehicles, developing an acute awareness that balanced alertness with the need for rest and mental recuperation. Every sense was engaged, every observation could prove important, and yet there were fleeting instances of beauty, grace, or humor that made the repetition of daily life tolerable, even meaningful. Afternoons often drifted into a slow rhythm of work and observation. Soldiers learned to navigate the fine line between alertness and exhaustion, moving through tasks that might seem repetitive, yet held hidden consequences for carelessness or oversight. Digging trenches, reinforcing barricades, or repairing the endless equipment required not just physical effort but mental discipline, a constant awareness that any mistake could ripple through the fragile balance of their unit's safety. Yet within this repetitive labor, there were moments of improvisation, small ways to assert individuality. A carved pattern in a wooden beam, a makeshift arrangement of personal belongings, or a clever organization of rations that turned a simple meal into a brief ritual of satisfaction. The landscape itself was a constant teacher, offering lessons in both caution and patience. Fields, forests, and villages were studied, scanned, and memorized as soldiers tried to anticipate the movements of others, friend or foe, and to interpret subtle signs in the environment. The sound of birds, the direction of smoke, or the tracks left by animals could provide critical information, and men learned to value observation as much as action. Even minor changes, a shift in the wind, the approach of clouds, the distant echo of machinery, could transform a quiet day into a tense alert, sharpening senses that would otherwise grow numb under routine. Meals, though often humble, remained central to both survival and morale. Bread, sometimes stale, occasionally fresh, was accompanied by thin slices of preserved meat, a sparse portion of margarine, or a boiled potato when supplies allowed. Coffee, a rare comfort, became a focal point of small gatherings, brewed over open flames with painstaking care. Soldiers would sit, silently or in quiet conversation, savoring the warmth, the aroma, and the brief reprieve from work or worry. When something special arrived, a tin of chocolate, a small sausage, or even a fresh egg, the joy was subtle but genuine, shared in hushed tones or small gestures of generosity that reinforced bonds within the unit. Evening routines brought their own structure and small pleasures. Lanterns were lit, casting dancing shadows across tents and barracks, illuminating faces lined with fatigue, thought, and faint amusement. Soldiers inspected equipment, prepared uniforms for the following day, and engaged in minor repairs that demanded patience and focus. Quiet conversation meandered naturally from speculation about future movements to memories of home, from philosophical musings to invented stories or exaggerated tales of exploits. Humor often crept in, dark or absurd, and laughter became a fragile, precious currency that maintained cohesion and lifted spirits in subtle, essential ways. Letters from home continued to hold immense emotional weight. A single folded piece of paper could shift a man's mood, bringing tears, hope, or bittersweet reflection. Photographs, trinkets, and small tokens carried alongside letters were equally treasured, objects that anchored memory and identity in a world increasingly defined by the impersonal demands of war. Men treated these items with care, hiding them in pockets, sewing them into fabric, or storing them in wooden boxes, as if by protecting the object they could also preserve the essence of home, family, and a life beyond the uniform. Rest, while essential, was often fragmented and uneasy. Sleeping in tents, on wooden bunks, or in narrow dugouts meant contending with cold, dampness, insects, and the constant awareness of potential danger. Dreams were vivid and disjointed, blending memory with imagination, home with battlefield, comfort with dread. Men learned to find moments of rest wherever possible, closing their eyes in brief intervals, seeking mental escape even as their bodies remained tense and ready. The act of sleeping itself became a skill, a measured negotiation between relaxation and readiness, a delicate balance that could determine the difference between alertness and vulnerability. Social interaction was subtle, yet central. Soldiers formed small networks of support, sharing stories, advice, and small tokens of comfort. Jokes, whispered comments, and casual storytelling reinforced bonds, building a shared culture within the unit that existed alongside formal hierarchy and orders. In these exchanges, men could reveal their fears, hopes, and humanity, even as the broader machinery of war demanded conformity and obedience. Humor and companionship became as essential as food or equipment, sustaining morale and providing psychological resilience in a world defined by uncertainty. The mental landscape was constantly active. Soldiers navigated complex emotions, fear, longing, boredom, curiosity, and fleeting joy, while balancing the immediate demands of duty with thoughts of past experiences and imagined futures. Personal rituals developed, from repeating a phrase or prayer to arranging belongings in a particular way, each action an attempt to exert control in a life that was otherwise largely dictated by circumstance. Observation and anticipation became second nature, listening for the faintest sound, noting the smallest detail, reading the behavior of comrades, and interpreting the movements of both humans and nature alike. Even in moments of monotony, life revealed unexpected detail and fascination. Watching the dance of leaves in the wind, noticing the patterns of animal tracks, or hearing the subtle changes in distant sounds could spark reflection, curiosity, or a quiet sense of wonder. Men adapted to perceive the extraordinary within the ordinary, finding meaning and small joy in details that might seem inconsequential to an outsider but held deep significance for those navigating a daily existence marked by vigilance, endurance, and fleeting moments of relief. Nightfall brought a subtle shift in energy, a time when the day's labor was complete but vigilance remained essential. Soldiers moved quietly through the camp, tending to fires, arranging gear for the next day, or performing small maintenance tasks that could not wait until morning. Lanterns flickered, casting long, wavering shadows across tents and walls, and the ambient sounds of the night, rustling leaves, distant animals, the occasional echo of voices from other units, created a living backdrop that demanded attention, yet offered a strangely calming rhythm. Even in darkness, men remained alert, aware that a single misstep could have consequences, yet they found ways to blend duty with moments of personal reflection or quiet companionship. The night meal, when it existed, was a modest affair. Soldiers gathered around small fires or simple stoves, breaking bread, sharing thin slices of meat, and occasionally passing along a piece of chocolate or a tin of preserved fruit. Coffee, when supplies allowed, was a cherished ritual, its warmth and aroma offering both comfort and a brief mental escape from the harsh realities surrounding them. Conversation during these moments flowed in gentle waves, moving from news of distant fronts to tales of home, from quiet jokes to whispered observations about life in the camp. The tone was soft, cautious, yet intimate, as if the dim light itself encouraged honesty and subtle reflection. Rest, though fragmented, remained a precious commodity. Soldiers learned to find sleep in unconventional ways, curled in corners, leaning against walls, or sharing a bunk with a comrade for warmth and security. Dreams were often fleeting, a mixture of memory, imagination, and the residual stress of daily life. A brief nap could be restorative, yet men remained ready to awaken at the slightest disturbance. The snap of a branch, the distant cry of an animal, or a sudden change in the wind. Over time, this constant tension became second nature, an ingrained aspect of both body and mind, shaping the way soldiers moved, spoke, and perceived the world around them. Entertainment was subtle, emerging organically from the constraints of camp life. Small games with dice, cards, or improvised tools provided distraction and camaraderie. Storytelling, a timeless human activity, offered mental escape and reinforced social bonds, blending humor, suspense, and the occasional moral lesson. Music, whether improvised or played on a borrowed instrument, filled the night air with fleeting beauty, a reminder of culture, artistry, and life beyond uniformed existence. These activities, though minor in scope, became essential elements of survival, fostering resilience and a shared sense of identity within the unit. Superstitions and rituals intertwined seamlessly with daily routines. Soldiers often carried charms, repeated certain phrases, or followed idiosyncratic routines designed to ward off misfortune or influence the unpredictable circumstances of war. These behaviors, while sometimes playful or absurd, served deeper psychological purposes, offering comfort, a sense of control, and an acknowledgement of forces beyond the visible world. Observing the behavior of comrades, interpreting signs in nature, and maintaining these rituals became part of the unspoken code that bound the unit together, providing subtle stability in an otherwise unpredictable environment. Conversations frequently meandered between the practical and the reflective. Soldiers discussed equipment, rationing, and strategy, but also speculated about the future, reminisced about childhood, or debated philosophical questions about morality, loyalty, and duty. Humor, often dark or ironic, provided relief and reinforced camaraderie, allowing men to voice anxieties in coded, socially acceptable ways. Even in the quietest moments, the mind was engaged, interpreting signals, anticipating outcomes, and navigating the complex interplay between immediate reality and imagined possibilities. Physical fatigue was a constant, yet men adapted. Marches, labor, and guard duty pushed the body to its limits, while rationed meals, sleep deprivation, and environmental exposure compounded the challenge. Soldiers developed techniques to conserve energy, maintain strength, and endure discomfort, from layering clothing strategically to pacing their movements during long tasks. Even minor injuries, blisters, frostbite, or sprains were treated with practical ingenuity, often with makeshift solutions that relied on observation, experience, and the collective knowledge of the unit. Communication remained vital. Messages between units, letters from home, or even whispered instructions carried weight, influencing morale and decision-making alike. The anticipation of news, whether personal or operational, added a layer of tension to the routine, as men balanced the hope of positive information with the fear of disappointment or danger. Small tokens, letters, photographs, trinkets retained disproportionate significance, providing emotional sustenance and reinforcing memory, identity, and a sense of continuity amidst disruption. Night was also a time of reflection, when soldiers confronted the paradoxical blend of fear, hope, boredom, and fleeting joy that defined their existence. Moments of silence, broken only by ambient sounds, offered opportunities to consider the day's events, internalize lessons, or imagine alternative outcomes. The mind wandered between home, present duties, and imagined futures, forming a continuous narrative that sustained mental equilibrium. In these hours, subtle patterns emerged, gestures of camaraderie, the rhythm of routine, and the occasional triumph of small comfort that maintained cohesion, fostered resilience, and created a fragile yet enduring sense of normalcy. The environment itself offered constant feedback, shaping perception, behavior, and decision-making. The rustle of leaves, the flight of birds, the scent of smoke or earth, all became part of an intricate sensory landscape, guiding action and influencing emotional state. Soldiers developed an intuitive awareness, reading cues from nature, the terrain, and the movement of comrades, cultivating skills that were simultaneously practical, psychological, and deeply human. Even mundane observations, patterns in the sky, shifts in temperature, or subtle sounds, could hold significance, offering insight, warning, or fleeting beauty in an otherwise constrained existence. As night deepened, the world outside seemed both distant and immediate, a strange duality that soldiers became intimately familiar with. The quiet was punctuated by subtle sounds, the rustle of fabric as someone adjusted their uniform, the faint clink of a mess tin being set down, the distant cry of an animal echoing across fields. Every noise carried weight, every shadow suggested possibility, Yet within this constant vigilance, there was a rhythm, a comforting structure that guided movement and thought. Men adapted, blending alertness with moments of near meditation, their senses finely tuned to both danger and opportunity, to both routine and unpredictability. Food remained a central thread connecting past, present, and hope for the future. When available, bread was shared carefully, often broken into uneven pieces that each soldier claimed with silent etiquette. Sausages, thin slices of preserved meat, or small tins of fish became commodities of subtle negotiation, exchanged quietly to strengthen bonds or reward vigilance. Coffee was brewed meticulously over small fires, its bitter warmth serving as both stimulant and ritual. Even minor treats, a sliver of chocolate, a small portion of sugar, or a rare fruit, became focal points for conversation, reflection, and the gentle humor that helped men endure the monotony and tension of daily life. Guard duty imposed its own unique rhythm, a combination of observation, patience, and quiet reflection. Soldiers walked along predetermined paths, noting the slightest deviations in terrain, the subtle shifts in sound, the movement of wildlife or other humans in the distance. Standing still for hours was physically challenging, yet mentally it became a space for thought and strategy. Men observed not just the environment, but each other, reading body language, gauging fatigue, and noting habits. The night became a tapestry of subtle patterns, each woven with attention, patience, and an ever-present sense of responsibility. Letters and small tokens from home retained profound significance. A folded piece of paper, slightly worn at the edges, could evoke emotions so vivid that the physical discomforts of camp life momentarily receded. Photographs, trinkets, or simple charms were treated with reverence, hidden safely within clothing or personal belongings. These objects acted as anchors, tying soldiers to lives beyond the war, reminding them of love, stability, and memory in a context defined by impermanence and danger. Sharing these items with trusted comrades, even in brief gestures, reinforced bonds and offered a small measure of psychological stability. Even the mundane aspects of daily life were layered with significance. Polishing boots, cleaning rifles, or maintaining uniforms were acts that reinforced discipline, focus, and a sense of control. Each motion was deliberate, each repetition a minor ritual that created order in an otherwise chaotic world. Attention to detail in these small tasks was both practical and symbolic, affirming the soldier's identity, competence, and readiness. The routine itself, often overlooked, became a quiet testament to resilience, patience, and human adaptability. The evenings were also a time for quiet reflection and conversation. Soldiers spoke in low tones, discussing distant news, recounting memories of childhood, or speculating about events far beyond their reach. Humor, frequently dark or ironic, served as a coping mechanism, allowing men to articulate fear and uncertainty in socially acceptable ways. Storytelling blended reality and imagination, creating shared narratives that fostered cohesion, reinforced values, and offered mental escape. Music, when available, infused the air with subtle beauty, an improvised melody on a small instrument, a whispered song, or the rhythm of percussion created from everyday objects, bringing fleeting joy and human expression into a context dominated by restriction and vigilance. Sleep was both sought after and wary. Resting in tents, bunks, or dugouts, soldiers navigated discomfort, cold, and the lingering tension of unpredictability. Dreams were often fragmented, mixing memory, imagination, and anxiety, leaving men to awaken with an immediate awareness of vulnerability. Even brief periods of sleep required adaptation, strategically positioning the body, sharing warmth, and maintaining readiness for sudden activity. Over time, the skill of resting amidst chaos became as essential as any weapon, ration, or manual of procedure. Social rituals, small yet profound, defined interpersonal life. Soldiers exchanged gestures of reassurance, small tokens, or quiet advice, reinforcing a network of mutual support that extended beyond formal hierarchy. Competitions, card games, or minor contests of skill offered distraction, camaraderie, and a subtle assertion of individuality. Humor threaded through these interactions, offering relief, shaping culture, and providing subtle mechanisms for navigating fear, uncertainty, and monotony. Even in the absence of direct orders, these micro-rituals structured daily existence and sustained morale. Observation, a constant companion, shaped every action. Soldiers learned to interpret signs in the environment, wind direction, animal movement, distant sounds, as well as subtle cues from comrades' behavior. Awareness extended across multiple layers of experience: tactical, psychological, and social. Each detail, however minor, could inform decisions, predict outcomes, or provide insight into otherwise hidden patterns. This continuous attention to the environment reinforced both survival skills and mental acuity, creating a form of alertness that was simultaneously exhausting and indispensable. Even in repetitive or uneventful hours, the ordinary world revealed depth and nuance. A shaft of moonlight across a tent, the distant murmur of a river, or the faint scent of smoke from a nearby village could evoke reflection, curiosity, or fleeting pleasure. Soldiers became attuned to these subtleties, discovering beauty, intrigue, and meaning in contexts that might appear mundane to an outsider. Life at the front, though defined by structure, duty, and constant vigilance, was also composed of these transient, intimate moments, each contributing to resilience, awareness, and the quiet assertion of humanity amidst the machinery of war. Nights, though dark and often cold, were never entirely silent. The world outside the camp seemed alive with subtle sounds: a branch snapping under the weight of an unseen animal, the distant howl of a dog, or the soft murmur of voices carried on the wind from another unit. Each noise demanded attention, yet simultaneously created a rhythm, a cadence that soldiers learned to navigate instinctively. Even in these hours, routine and vigilance intertwined. Walking the perimeter, adjusting gear, or quietly conversing became acts of both necessity and reflection, blending duty with the human need for connection and observation. Meals at night, when they occurred, remained modest but meaningful. Soldiers gathered in small clusters around flickering lanterns or embers, breaking bread, sharing sparse rations of meat, or passing along a sliver of preserved cheese. Coffee, when available, was brewed slowly, the bitter warmth offering comfort and a momentary pause from the unrelenting awareness of the environment. Even small luxuries, a rare piece of chocolate or a few sugar cubes, were savored and quietly shared, strengthening bonds and reminding men of a world beyond uniformed existence. Conversation was soft and layered, practical discussion intertwined with storytelling, reflection, and humor, often tinged with irony or self-deprecation, providing both entertainment and emotional resilience. Guard duty and patrols required acute concentration, demanding both patience and awareness. Soldiers learned to interpret the environment with precision, noting shifts in wind, movement of animals, distant voices, or changes in terrain. Every step and every observation carried potential significance. Standing for hours, muscles tense, eyes scanning shadows and listening for subtle cues, men developed an almost meditative alertness, balancing focus with endurance. These periods, though physically taxing, offered unexpected opportunities for reflection, imagination, or quiet appreciation of the surrounding landscape, even amidst tension. Letters and tokens from home retained profound emotional value. A single photograph, worn and creased, could evoke memories so vivid they momentarily displaced fatigue or discomfort. Trinkets, charms, or small gifts served as talismans, carrying reassurance, identity, and connection to lives outside the immediate confines of camp. Soldiers guarded these items carefully, sometimes sharing them with trusted comrades, recognizing the subtle reinforcement they provided to morale and mental stability. The anticipation of new letters, no matter how delayed, added a layer of hope and psychological sustenance to daily routines. Even minor rituals became central to coping and resilience. Cleaning weapons, polishing boots, or arranging personal belongings was both practical and symbolic, creating structure and asserting control over an otherwise unpredictable world. Small acts of creativity, carving initials, stitching designs onto clothing, or improvising solutions for minor inconveniences, served as outlets for individuality and subtle assertion of self. Each task, however ordinary, was imbued with significance, reinforcing discipline, mental acuity, and the continuity of personal identity amidst the machinery of war. Conversations in the quiet hours ranged from practical to reflective, weaving together speculation, memory, and imagination. Soldiers debated rumors, discussed distant news, and shared personal anecdotes, blending humor with insight and observation. Dark, ironic, or absurd jokes circulated, providing subtle relief from the omnipresent tension. Storytelling often merged reality and imagination, producing shared narratives that reinforced cohesion, offered mental escape, and allowed men to navigate fear and uncertainty indirectly. Music, when possible, enhanced these moments. A few notes played on a borrowed instrument, a whispered song, or a rhythmic percussion improvised from common objects brought brief beauty and a reminder of human creativity. Rest, while essential, was tenuous and fragmented. Soldiers slept in tents, narrow bunks, or dugouts, contending with cold, dampness, insects, and the lingering need for vigilance. Dreams were vivid yet disjointed, a mixture of memory, imagination, and anxiety. Even brief intervals of sleep demanded adaptation, strategic positioning, shared warmth, and preparedness for sudden disturbance. Over time, soldiers developed skill in resting amidst uncertainty, turning sleep into both a necessity and a minor exercise in controlled surrender to the body's needs. Social rituals reinforced cohesion and psychological resilience. Games of chance, minor competitions, or storytelling sessions provided distraction and amusement, fostering trust and camaraderie. Humor threaded through these activities, offering relief and a framework for articulating anxiety indirectly. Small gestures, sharing rations, advising on tasks, or quietly observing a comrade, became micro-rituals that strengthened bonds, maintained morale, and provided subtle structure within the regimented and often unpredictable environment of war. Observation, a constant companion, shaped every action. Soldiers honed the ability to interpret subtle environmental cues, the direction of smoke, the pattern of animal movement, the behavior of others. This heightened awareness extended across multiple domains, tactical, psychological, and social, informing decisions, anticipating threats, and creating opportunities for subtle assertion of agency. The ordinary world revealed complexity and nuance, each minor detail a potential source of insight, warning, or fleeting beauty. Even within routine and repetition, life offered moments of fascination and reflection. Moonlight filtering through tents, the distant murmur of rivers, or the scent of nearby fires could spark curiosity, nostalgia, or quiet pleasure. Soldiers became attuned to these subtleties, finding meaning and small joys amidst monotony and vigilance. In this balance of danger, observation, and fleeting beauty, the contours of human experience persisted, quietly asserting presence and resilience in a world dominated by the imperatives of survival and duty. Early mornings, before the first light touched the horizon, were often the quietest and the most deceptive. Soldiers stirred from their tents or bunks with careful precision, aware that even a small sound could travel across the still camp. The air carried a mix of scents, damp earth, wood smoke from the night's fires, and the faint, persistent tang of preserved food, which seemed to anchor men in the tangible reality of their surroundings. Some took these early moments for reflection, silently counting the days or replaying memories of home, while others moved immediately into the rituals of preparation, adjusting uniforms, checking boots, or inspecting weapons, each action precise and deliberate, a quiet assertion of order over uncertainty. Breakfast, when available, was often humble but performed with care. Thin slices of bread, occasionally supplemented with a small portion of meat or a boiled egg, were consumed quietly, sometimes accompanied by a steaming cup of coffee brewed over a small flame. These moments, though brief, became anchors in the unrelenting rhythm of camp life, offering soldiers not just nourishment but a structured pause to gather energy, share observation, or exchange quiet commentary with comrades. Even the simplest acts, pouring coffee, breaking bread, or distributing rations, were performed with implicit rules and attention to fairness, as subtle social codes maintained cohesion and mutual respect. Work and duty flowed seamlessly into one another, blending physical exertion with observation and strategic thinking. Tasks were varied, reinforcing barricades, tending to equipment, clearing paths, or performing administrative checks. Every action was layered with multiple considerations. A single misstep might jeopardize safety, slow progress, or disrupt the subtle balance of unit coordination. Yet within this structured labor, soldiers found pockets of autonomy, ways to exercise creativity or personal expression. A carved design on a wooden crate, an efficient reorganization of supplies, or a clever adjustment in the preparation of rations. These small acts, though subtle, reinforced both identity and morale, creating a sense of accomplishment within an environment defined largely by obligation. Observation extended beyond the immediate physical environment to include interactions with comrades, the patterns of the camp, and the subtle dynamics of morale. Soldiers read each other's behavior carefully. Gestures, facial expressions, and tone of voice often conveyed more than formal orders. Small acts of assistance, quiet encouragement, or shared humor strengthened bonds and fostered trust, while even minor lapses in attention or cooperation could ripple through the group, producing tension or anxiety. Awareness became multidimensional, encompassing not just survival in the physical sense but the subtle management of social equilibrium, emotional states, and collective resilience. The midday hours often brought both monotony and opportunity. Soldiers took advantage of brief pauses to tend to personal needs, mending uniforms, cleaning gear, or engaging in small personal projects. Writing letters or journaling became a subtle form of psychological maintenance, a way to process experience, retain memory, and maintain identity. Some men developed unique routines or small rituals, arranging belongings, sketching, or quietly observing wildlife, that provided both distraction and a sense of continuity, blending necessity with subtle pleasure and reflection. Food continued to anchor both body and mind. Lunches were simple, often consisting of preserved meats, hard biscuits, or boiled vegetables, supplemented occasionally by foraged greens or a rare piece of fruit. Coffee remained a central ritual, brewed with care, its aroma offering comfort and continuity amidst the repetitive demands of camp life. When supplies allowed, small treats, a bit of chocolate, sugar, or a preserved fruit, were shared quietly, reinforcing bonds and offering subtle relief. These shared moments, though brief, carried significance, sustaining morale and reinforcing the unspoken social fabric of the unit. Evenings shifted from labor to reflection, conversation, and minor recreation. Soldiers gathered in small groups, sharing stories, engaging in quiet games, or improvising music with available objects. Humor, often dark or ironic, threaded through these interactions, providing psychological relief and reinforcing cohesion. Storytelling merged reality with imagination, producing shared narratives that entertained, informed, and subtly instructed, cultivating a collective culture within the constraints of camp life. Sleep remained tentative yet vital. Soldiers navigated the discomforts of cold, cramped spaces, insects, and lingering tension with practiced skill. Brief naps were treasured, yet vigilance persisted. Ears remained alert to sudden noises, bodies poised for immediate response. Dreams were vivid and often fragmented, blending memory, imagination, and anxiety, while mental preparation for the following day began even during slumber. Rest, in all its fragmented forms, became an exercise in balancing surrender with readiness, a skill as crucial as any physical ability or tactical knowledge. Small personal rituals provided stability and psychological comfort. Soldiers arranged gear, polished equipment, or maintained specific routines with meticulous attention, creating structure and a sense of control amidst uncertainty. Superstitions, charms, and habitual phrases offered additional layers of mental security, bridging the known and the unknown, the controllable and the unpredictable. These micro-rituals, woven into daily life, were essential anchors, providing continuity, reassurance, and subtle assertion of personal agency in an environment dominated by external demands. Even routine observation could inspire fascination. The play of light across the landscape, the flight of birds, the distant shimmer of a river, or the faint movement of clouds became points of reflection, curiosity, and subtle wonder. Soldiers attuned themselves to these nuances, discovering beauty and meaning amidst repetition and tension. Life, even when regimented and demanding, was composed of these small, ephemeral moments, each contributing to endurance, perception, and the subtle preservation of humanity within the machinery of war. Days often merged into one another in a way that blurred the distinction between labor, observation, and reflection. Soldiers became adept at moving through routines almost instinctively, each task, whether digging trenches, reinforcing barricades, or cleaning weapons, performed with layered awareness of both immediate necessity and subtle consequences. There was a rhythm to these motions, a combination of physical exertion, mental calculation, and quiet attention that shaped each day into a complex sequence of survival, adaptation, and subtle assertion of agency. Meals remained a constant, anchoring soldiers in both body and mind. Bread, thinly sliced and sometimes stale, was supplemented with preserved meats, boiled potatoes, or occasionally a rare treat such as chocolate or sugar. Coffee, brewed carefully over small fires, became more than a stimulant. It was a ritual, a brief moment of comfort and reflection, often shared with comrades in hushed tones. Even minor acts, such as breaking a loaf evenly or passing a piece of chocolate, carried weight, reinforcing subtle social bonds and mutual respect. The preparation and consumption of food became a focal point, a recurring structure that provided stability amidst the unpredictability of camp life. Observation extended beyond immediate survival. Soldiers studied not only the terrain, weather, and wildlife, but also the behavior of their peers. Facial expressions, gestures, and tone of voice were analyzed instinctively, informing judgments, predicting responses, and maintaining social equilibrium. Small acts of camaraderie, sharing rations, offering advice, or quietly supporting a fatigued comrade, reinforced cohesion, ensuring that the unit functioned effectively despite the strain and monotony of daily existence. Even during seemingly uneventful moments, the environment offered constant instruction. The shift of wind, the faint scent of smoke, the distant sound of movement, each subtle cue could carry critical information. Soldiers developed acute awareness, interpreting patterns in nature and human behavior alike. This heightened observation was simultaneously practical, psychological, and deeply human, providing not only safety but a sense of connection to the environment, the rhythms of life, and the continuity of experience. Letters and small tokens from home were treasured beyond their physical value. A photograph, slightly creased, could evoke vivid recollections of family and familiar landscapes. Trinkets, charms, or folded notes were carefully preserved, often sewn into clothing or tucked into pockets. These objects anchored soldiers in memory, identity, and hope, acting as subtle reminders of life beyond the camp and the enduring presence of loved ones. Sharing them quietly with trusted comrades reinforced social bonds and provided mutual psychological support. Even minor rituals carried significance. Soldiers polished boots, inspected rifles, or arranged belongings with meticulous care, combining practicality with symbolic assertion of control. These acts, though ordinary, became essential to mental stability and a sense of personal competence. Superstitions, habitual phrases, or repeated gestures offered additional comfort, providing a subtle counterbalance to the unpredictability of duty, environment, and circumstance. Rest remained a delicate negotiation between relaxation and readiness. Sleeping in tents, narrow bunks, or dugouts demanded adaptation, positioning for warmth, maintaining vigilance, and preparing for sudden disturbances. Dreams, vivid yet fragmented, often mingled memory, imagination, and anxiety. Brief periods of sleep were treasures, moments of relief from the constant tension, yet every soldier retained a mental alertness that blurred the line between rest and readiness. Over time, this skill became as crucial as any physical or tactical ability, a quiet survival mechanism forged through repetition and necessity. Social life, subtle but vital, flourished within constraints. Storytelling, low games of skill or chance, and improvisational music infused the environment with humanity. Humor threaded through conversation, often dark, ironic, or absurd, allowing soldiers to voice tension and navigate fear without direct confrontation. Shared narratives blended imagination with reality, reinforcing bonds and sustaining collective identity, while small acts of collaboration and mutual support cultivated trust and subtle cohesion. Even routine observation revealed richness and complexity. The movement of clouds, the ripple of a distant river, the call of an unseen bird, each detail offered reflection, curiosity, or fleeting beauty. Soldiers learned to value these nuances, finding significance in otherwise mundane moments. Life, though regimented and demanding, persisted in small, ephemeral observations, creating continuity, reinforcing perception, and sustaining the quiet assertion of humanity amidst a rigid, structured existence. Despite repetition, monotony, and strain, days contained subtle variability that demanded adaptability. Weather could change unpredictably, supplies could arrive or be delayed, and unforeseen tasks or emergencies could disrupt routine. Soldiers navigated these fluctuations through discipline, observation, and creative adaptation, turning small adjustments, how to manage clothing in cold dampness, improvising solutions for minor discomfort, or rearranging equipment for efficiency, into acts of agency. Even the smallest adaptation carried psychological weight, reinforcing resilience, self-efficacy, and the ongoing sense that, despite constraints, individuals could influence their immediate experience. Afternoons often carried a unique combination of monotony and subtle intrigue. Soldiers performed repetitive tasks, yet each task demanded attention, adaptability, and quiet ingenuity. Digging trenches, maintaining equipment, or repairing uniforms required not just physical effort but constant mental engagement. The environment was never static. Subtle changes in weather, terrain, or the behavior of animals and comrades demanded careful observation. Even minor shifts, a slight alteration in the wind, a distant sound, or the unexpected arrival of supplies, could create a ripple effect across routines, requiring soldiers to adapt seamlessly while maintaining vigilance and discipline. Meals continued to serve as both practical necessity and psychological anchor. Bread, occasionally supplemented with boiled potatoes, thin slices of preserved meat, or a rare piece of chocolate, provided more than sustenance. It structured the day, created opportunities for social interaction, and offered moments of comfort. Coffee remained central, its bitter warmth a ritual that anchored attention, facilitated quiet conversation, and created fleeting intimacy amidst otherwise impersonal surroundings. Sharing even the smallest treats became a subtle form of camaraderie, reinforcing bonds and sustaining morale in ways that words alone could not. Observation extended across multiple dimensions. Soldiers studied terrain and weather, as well as the behavior of peers, constantly interpreting subtle cues. Facial expressions, gestures, and tone of voice carried significance, revealing fatigue, morale, or unspoken concerns. Trust and cohesion were reinforced through attentive observation, quiet support, and small acts of generosity or guidance. Awareness became a constant companion, simultaneously practical and psychological, shaping action, decision-making, and social equilibrium. Even in repetitive hours, the natural world offered lessons, reflection, and fleeting fascination. The rustle of leaves, the flight of birds, or the distant murmur of a stream became points of meditation, curiosity, or subtle pleasure. Soldiers adapted to notice and value these small details, creating pockets of mental escape, sensory engagement, and emotional resilience. Observation, interpretation, and reflection became interwoven into daily existence, blending the ordinary and the extraordinary in a life defined by both structure and unpredictability. Letters and small tokens from home maintained immense emotional significance. A photograph, slightly worn at the edges, could evoke vivid recollections of family, friends, and familiar landscapes. Charms, trinkets, and folded notes were preserved carefully, often hidden within clothing or personal gear. These objects anchored memory, identity, and hope, providing continuity and reassurance amidst disruption. Sharing them with trusted comrades strengthened bonds and offered subtle psychological support, a reminder that personal connections persisted even in the midst of war. Small rituals carried disproportionate importance. Soldiers polished boots, cleaned rifles, and arranged personal belongings with precision, creating a sense of order and control within a context often defined by uncertainty. Habitual phrases, repeated gestures, and superstitions offered psychological stability, bridging the gap between the known and unknown, the controllable and the unpredictable. These minor practices were essential anchors, sustaining both personal identity and collective cohesion. Social interaction, though constrained, was critical for morale. Quiet conversation, games of chance, improvisational music, and storytelling provided distraction, amusement, and mental stimulation. Humor, frequently dark or ironic, allowed soldiers to navigate fear and stress indirectly. Shared stories combined imagination with observation, reinforcing group identity and collective culture. Even small gestures of support, cooperation, or reassurance carried weight, strengthening social bonds and creating resilience within the unit. Rest, always tentative, was a delicate balance between relaxation and readiness. Sleeping in tents, narrow bunks, or dugouts, soldiers contended with cold, dampness, insects, and constant awareness of potential disturbance. Brief naps were prized, yet vigilance remained. Hearing the slightest sound, sensing changes in the environment, and remaining poised for immediate action. Dreams blended memory, anxiety, and imagination, shaping perceptions, reinforcing memory, and subtly influencing emotional state. Mastering rest amidst uncertainty became a vital skill, as essential as any tactical or physical ability. Even ordinary observation revealed depth. The subtle play of light across the terrain, the movement of clouds, the sound of distant animals, or the faint aroma of smoke became sources of reflection, fascination, or fleeting pleasure. Soldiers attuned themselves to these nuances, cultivating both awareness and appreciation. Life, though regimented and demanding, persisted in these small moments, creating continuity, sustaining mental engagement, and preserving humanity within the rigid structure of military existence. Adaptability remained essential. Minor disruptions, unexpected weather, late or altered supplies, emergent tasks, or social tension required immediate adjustment. Soldiers learned to innovate within constraints, balancing duty, efficiency, and personal comfort. Even small adaptations, such as rearranging equipment, adjusting clothing for warmth, or modifying daily routines, carried significance. Each decision reinforced agency, resilience, and subtle mastery over circumstances that were otherwise largely controlled by external forces. As the sun climbed higher, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the camp, soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, balancing duty with constant observation. Tasks overlapped seamlessly. Some men reinforced barricades, others tended to equipment, while a few quietly repaired uniforms or prepared rations for the day. Each action, though seemingly routine, demanded attention to detail and a subtle awareness of the surrounding environment. Even minor missteps, a poorly tightened strap, a misaligned weapon, or an overlooked sound, could ripple outward, affecting not only the individual but the cohesion and efficiency of the group. Meals punctuated these routines, providing both sustenance and psychological continuity. Thin slices of bread, occasionally accompanied by boiled potatoes, preserved meat, or the rare fruit, were consumed with measured care. Coffee, brewed slowly over small fires, remained a comforting ritual, its aroma weaving through the camp and subtly easing tension. Sharing even the smallest treats, a piece of chocolate, a sugar cube, or a tin of preserved fruit, became acts of camaraderie, reinforcing bonds and creating fleeting moments of connection amidst otherwise constrained circumstances. Observation was constant, extending beyond the immediate physical environment. Soldiers monitored each other, interpreting subtle cues in posture, expression, and tone. These readings influenced decisions, social interactions, and even morale, creating a delicate balance between personal responsibility and collective well-being. Acts of quiet assistance, reassurance, or advice strengthened cohesion, forming an invisible network of mutual support that underpinned survival in a context defined by unpredictability and fatigue. Letters and tokens from home were treasured beyond their material value. A photograph, slightly worn or creased, could evoke vivid memories, transporting a soldier momentarily to another world. Charms, trinkets, and handwritten notes were carefully preserved, tucked into pockets or sewn into clothing, providing both psychological comfort and continuity of identity. Sharing these objects with trusted comrades reinforced social bonds and offered subtle emotional support, reminding soldiers that connections persisted despite the isolating conditions of military life. Rituals, both practical and symbolic, structured daily existence. Cleaning weapons, polishing boots, arranging gear, and repeating habitual gestures were acts of control, discipline, and subtle assertion of self. Superstitions, repeated phrases, and personal routines created psychological anchors, bridging the gap between the predictable and the uncertain, the controllable and the chaotic. These micro-practices sustained morale, reinforced resilience, and fostered a sense of stability in an environment dominated by external forces. Social interaction, while limited, played a critical role in maintaining mental equilibrium. Quiet conversations, storytelling, small games, and improvisational music filled the spaces between labor and rest. Humor, often dark or ironic, allowed soldiers to process fear and tension indirectly, providing both relief and cohesion. Shared narratives blended memory, observation, and imagination, producing a collective culture that reinforced identity and belonging. Small acts of cooperation, generosity, and attentiveness subtly reinforced trust and mutual support, creating a resilient social framework. Rest, although fragmented, remained essential. Soldiers navigated tents, bunks, and dugouts with care, managing cold, dampness, insects, and the omnipresent need for vigilance. Even brief periods of sleep demanded adaptation, strategic positioning for warmth, shared space for security, and mental readiness for sudden disturbances. Dreams were vivid yet disjointed, blending memory, anxiety, and imagination, influencing perception, emotional state, and anticipation of future events. Mastery of rest became a vital skill, complementing physical endurance and tactical competence. The natural environment offered both instruction and fascination. Subtle changes in wind, temperature, or light, the movement of animals, and the faint scent of distant fires all provided information, reflection, and fleeting beauty. Soldiers attuned themselves to these nuances, learning to extract meaning, anticipate challenges, and appreciate transient moments. Life persisted in these small observations, sustaining mental engagement, offering continuity, and preserving humanity amidst the strictures of military existence. Adaptability was ever present. Minor disruptions, shifts in weather, delayed supplies, emergent tasks, or social friction required immediate adjustment. Soldiers innovated within constraints, balancing efficiency, duty, and personal comfort. Small improvisations, rearranging gear, adjusting clothing, or modifying daily routines, reinforced agency, resilience, and subtle mastery over circumstances that were otherwise largely beyond individual control. Even within repetition, there existed an underlying richness. The interplay of light and shadow, the murmur of distant rivers, or the occasional call of wildlife provided both sensory engagement and mental diversion. Soldiers cultivated awareness of these subtleties, finding moments of reflection, curiosity, and fleeting beauty amidst structured labor. Life, regimented and demanding, was interwoven with these ephemeral observations, sustaining continuity, perception, and a quiet assertion of humanity within the machinery of war. Afternoons often carried a peculiar rhythm, a combination of repetitive labor and heightened awareness that demanded both endurance and adaptability. Soldiers moved through the camp performing tasks with practiced efficiency, repairing equipment, reinforcing barricades, tending to uniforms, or preparing rations. Each action required layered attention, not only to immediate utility but also to subtle environmental cues. A faint shift in the wind, a distant rustle of leaves, or the unexpected appearance of a shadow could alter priorities instantly, reminding every man that vigilance remained essential even in routine activity. Meals remained pivotal, anchoring both body and mind. Bread, thin slices of preserved meat, boiled potatoes, or the occasional rare treat like chocolate were consumed with quiet care. Coffee, prepared slowly over embers or a small stove, infused the camp with its characteristic aroma, signaling brief moments of calm and fostering social connection. Sharing even the smallest morsels or sips became an act of subtle camaraderie, reinforcing bonds and providing fleeting solace in the unrelenting flow of labor and observation. Observation extended in multiple dimensions. Soldiers monitored the terrain, weather, and subtle changes in animal behavior, but equally, they watched each other. Expressions, gestures, and tone conveyed fatigue, anxiety, or resolve, guiding interactions and social dynamics. Acts of quiet support, a small word of advice, or sharing resources reinforced cohesion, creating an invisible network of trust that sustained the unit under pressure. Awareness became a constant companion, shaping not only tactical decisions but also emotional equilibrium and social harmony. Even mundane moments contained unexpected richness. The way sunlight filtered through tree branches, the faint murmur of a distant stream, or the delicate flight of birds offered points of reflection, curiosity, or transient beauty. Soldiers attuned themselves to these subtleties, finding meaning and mental diversion in fleeting experiences. These observations were not trivial. They reinforced engagement, perception, and subtle mental resilience, allowing men to navigate the long hours of repetition with a sense of awareness and continuity. Letters, photographs, and small tokens from home retained immense significance. A well-worn photograph could transport a soldier momentarily to a different world, evoking memories of family, friends, and familiar landscapes. Trinkets or folded notes, carefully preserved in clothing or gear, served as talismans of hope and continuity. Sharing such items with trusted comrades reinforced social bonds, provided comfort, and subtly sustained morale, reminding soldiers of the human connections that persisted beyond the immediate demands of military life. Rituals, both practical and symbolic, structured daily life. Cleaning weapons, arranging personal items, polishing boots, and repeating habitual gestures were not mere routines. They were acts of discipline, control, and subtle assertion of identity. Superstitions, repeated phrases, or personal gestures offered psychological stability, bridging the gap between what could be controlled and the uncertainty of circumstances. These micro-practices created continuity and a sense of personal agency, essential for maintaining morale and resilience. Social interaction, though limited, remained vital. Quiet conversation, storytelling, small games, and improvised music filled the gaps between labor and rest. Humor, often dark or ironic, allowed men to process fear and stress indirectly, while shared narratives blended memory, imagination, and observation to reinforce collective identity and cohesion. Even minor gestures of support, attentiveness, or cooperation subtly strengthened trust, building a resilient social framework that sustained morale in otherwise constrained conditions. Rest required careful negotiation. Soldiers slept in tents, narrow bunks, or dugouts, navigating cold, dampness, insects, and the ever-present need for vigilance. Even brief periods of sleep demanded strategic adaptation, positioning for warmth, maintaining awareness, and readiness for sudden disturbances. Dreams were vivid, disjointed, and often infused with anxiety, memory, or imagination, influencing perception and emotional state. Mastery of rest, fragile yet essential, became as important as physical endurance or tactical skill, a subtle form of survival training. Even within repetition, the environment offered depth and complexity. Light, shadow, movement, and sound became sources of reflection, curiosity, or subtle pleasure. Soldiers cultivated awareness, learning to extract meaning and maintain engagement in small, transient observations. Life, though regimented and demanding, was composed of these ephemeral moments, sustaining mental resilience, perception, and a quiet assertion of humanity amidst the rigid structures of military existence. Adaptability persisted as a constant requirement. Minor disruptions, changes in weather, delayed supplies, emergent tasks, or interpersonal friction necessitated immediate adjustment. Soldiers learned to improvise within constraints, balancing efficiency, duty, and personal comfort. Even small modifications, such as rearranging gear, adjusting clothing, or changing routines, reinforced agency, resilience, and subtle mastery over circumstances largely beyond their control. Even as the day wore on, a subtle tension lingered in every movement, every glance, and every choice. Soldiers navigated the camp with the practiced rhythm of men who had learned to anticipate disruptions while performing mundane tasks. Repairing tents, adjusting equipment, or tending to small personal projects required not only physical skill but also constant awareness of the environment. A shift in the wind, a distant noise, or the fleeting shadow of an animal could demand instant attention, turning an ordinary task into a small exercise in vigilance and adaptability. Meals continued to structure life in ways both practical and psychological. Thin slices of bread, boiled potatoes, and preserved meat remained staples, occasionally complemented by a rare treat such as chocolate, sugar, or a small piece of fruit. Coffee, brewed carefully over coals or embers, became a sensory anchor, its aroma and warmth offering comfort and brief relief. Sharing morsels, passing coffee, or dividing treats created subtle moments of camaraderie, reinforcing trust and sustaining morale through understated acts of generosity and attention. Observation was constant and multidimensional. Soldiers monitored terrain, weather, and wildlife for practical cues, but they also read subtle signals in their comrades' behavior. Facial expressions, posture, and tone of voice revealed fatigue, resolve, or unspoken concerns, shaping interaction and coordination. Acts of quiet support, sharing advice, lending equipment, or offering reassurance strengthened cohesion, sustaining the social framework necessary for endurance and functionality in an unpredictable environment. Even in routine, life offered moments of subtle fascination. The play of sunlight through branches, the sound of wind across distant fields, or the faint ripple of a stream could capture attention, offering fleeting pleasure and a sense of continuity. Soldiers attuned themselves to these small details, finding mental relief and preserving engagement despite repetition and strain. These observations became anchors, linking the sensory world to memory, reflection, and quiet resilience. Letters and personal mementos retained profound emotional importance. A slightly worn photograph could evoke memories of home, family, or a past life, transporting a soldier briefly beyond the regimented confines of camp. Charms, notes, or small tokens were carefully preserved, often hidden within clothing or equipment, providing psychological stability. Sharing them with trusted comrades reinforced bonds and reminded soldiers that meaningful human connections persisted beyond immediate circumstances, offering hope, continuity, and subtle encouragement. Rituals shaped daily life in ways both practical and symbolic. Polishing boots, cleaning rifles, arranging personal items, or repeating habitual gestures were not simply chores, they were acts of discipline and subtle assertion of identity. Superstitions, habitual phrases, and personal gestures offered psychological comfort, bridging gaps between control and uncertainty. Each repeated act reinforced structure, morale, and a sense of agency, subtly counterbalancing the chaos and unpredictability of the surrounding world. Social interaction, though limited, was central to endurance. Quiet conversations, improvised music, small games, and storytelling created shared experiences and emotional cohesion. Humor, often ironic or dark, allowed soldiers to process fear and tension indirectly. Shared narratives blended imagination, observation, and memory, fostering collective identity and sustaining camaraderie. Minor gestures of attentiveness, cooperation, or encouragement strengthened trust and provided subtle reinforcement of group cohesion, crucial for both mental and physical resilience. Rest, though fragile, remained a vital component of survival. Sleeping in tents, narrow bunks, or dugouts required careful negotiation of space, warmth, and vigilance. Brief naps were treasured, yet awareness of potential disturbances remained constant. Dreams, vivid and often fragmented, interwove memory, imagination, and latent anxiety, influencing perception, emotional state, and preparedness for subsequent activity. Mastery of rest became as critical as any technical skill, shaping both endurance and cognitive acuity. Even within repetition, the natural world provided subtle richness. Shifts in light, movement of wildlife, distant sounds, or transient scents offered points of observation, reflection, and engagement. Soldiers learned to extract meaning from these fleeting details, maintaining focus, curiosity, and a fragile sense of beauty within an environment dominated by duty and structure. Life, regimented and demanding, persisted through these ephemeral observations, sustaining perception, mental resilience, and the quiet assertion of humanity. Adaptability remained a constant necessity. Minor disruptions, unexpected weather, delayed supplies, emergent tasks, or interpersonal friction required immediate response. Soldiers developed inventive solutions within constraints, balancing efficiency, obligation, and comfort. Even small adjustments, such as reorganizing gear, altering daily routines, or modifying clothing, reinforced agency, resilience, and subtle mastery over circumstances largely outside personal control. As the afternoon faded, shadows lengthened across the camp, creating pockets of quiet observation where subtle interactions and unnoticed details shaped the rhythm of life. Soldiers moved with habitual precision, completing tasks that ranged from repairing tents and reinforcing barricades to organizing supplies and tending to personal projects. Each action demanded more than mere physical effort. It required constant attention to nuance, awareness of the environment, and anticipation of potential disturbances. Even minor deviations, such as a misaligned strap, a slightly loose weapon, or an overlooked sound, could ripple through the routines, affecting both efficiency and the cohesion of the group. Meals continued to provide structure, comfort, and social engagement. Thin slices of bread, boiled potatoes, and preserved meats were consumed with deliberate care, occasionally complemented by small treats like chocolate or sugar cubes. Coffee, brewed over coals or a small flame, carried not only warmth but a brief sense of continuity, signaling respite amidst the constant demands of labor and vigilance. Sharing these simple pleasures, a bite of food, a sip of coffee, or a small ration, reinforced bonds, subtly strengthened morale, and provided brief psychological relief, reminding soldiers of the human connections that endured even under strain. Observation extended in all directions, encompassing both the physical environment and social dynamics. Soldiers monitored terrain, weather, and wildlife for practical information while simultaneously reading subtle cues in their comrades' behavior. Expressions, posture, and tone conveyed fatigue, resolve, or unspoken anxiety, influencing interactions, decisions, and coordination. Acts of quiet support, advice, assistance, or simply presence reinforced cohesion, forming an invisible network of trust that sustained the unit under pressure. Awareness became an essential skill, blending survival instincts, emotional intelligence, and social attunement. Even repetitive hours revealed layers of fascination. The flicker of sunlight through leaves, the distant ripple of a river, or the fleeting flight of birds provided fleeting moments of reflection and sensory engagement. Soldiers learned to notice and value these subtleties, which served as mental reprieves, sustaining engagement and preserving a sense of wonder amidst labor and monotony. Each observation, however small, contributed to the preservation of mental resilience and continuity, linking the immediate environment to memory, imagination, and quiet contemplation. Letters and personal tokens from home remained cherished. A slightly creased photograph could transport a soldier momentarily to another time and place, evoking vivid recollections of family, friends, or familiar landscapes. Charms, notes, or small mementos, carefully tucked into clothing or equipment, provided psychological stability and continuity. Sharing such items with trusted comrades reinforced social bonds, offered emotional support, and subtly nurtured morale, serving as reminders that meaningful human connections endured despite the isolating nature of military life. Rituals maintained order, comfort, and subtle agency. Polishing boots, cleaning rifles, arranging personal belongings, and repeating habitual gestures were more than chores. They were acts of discipline, self-assertion, and psychological grounding. Superstitions, repeated phrases, and personal habits provided continuity, bridging the predictable and unpredictable, the controllable and uncertain. These small acts of repetition created structure, preserved morale, and reinforced a sense of personal control in an environment defined by external authority and environmental uncertainty. Social interaction, though limited, was critical for sustaining mental equilibrium. Quiet conversations, shared stories, small games, and improvised music created moments of connection, distraction, and subtle instruction. Humor, often dark or ironic, allowed soldiers to process fear and stress indirectly, while shared narratives fused imagination with memory and observation, reinforcing collective identity and camaraderie. Minor gestures of attentiveness, cooperation, and encouragement strengthened trust, sustaining a resilient social framework vital for both psychological and physical endurance. Rest was both fragile and essential. Sleeping in tents, narrow bunks, or dugouts demanded careful adaptation to cold, dampness, insects, and the constant need for vigilance. Even brief periods of sleep required strategic positioning, awareness, and readiness for sudden disturbance. Dreams, vivid yet fragmented, interwove memory, anxiety, and imagination, influencing perception, emotional state, and preparation for subsequent tasks. Mastery of rest, though delicate, became as crucial as any technical skill or physical ability, shaping endurance, alertness, and subtle survival capacity. The natural world offered a constant source of observation, reflection, and fleeting engagement. Changes in light, wind, or movement, the faint murmur of a stream, or distant wildlife provided information, curiosity, and subtle aesthetic pleasure. Soldiers cultivated awareness of these details, maintaining focus, mental resilience, and connection to the rhythms of life amidst the regimented demands of duty. Life, though structured and demanding, persisted in these ephemeral observations, preserving perception, continuity, and a quiet sense of humanity. Adaptability remained ever-present. Minor disruptions, sudden weather changes, delayed supplies, emergent tasks, or interpersonal tensions required immediate adjustment. Soldiers improvised solutions within constraints, balancing efficiency, duty, and personal comfort. Small adjustments, whether rearranging gear, modifying clothing, or altering routine, reinforced personal agency, resilience, and subtle mastery over circumstances largely beyond direct control, shaping both individual endurance and group functionality. Evenings settled over the camp with a quiet inevitability, softening the harsh edges of labor and routine while revealing new nuances that demanded attention and awareness. Shadows lengthened across tents, equipment, and soldiers themselves, creating pockets of subtle observation that shaped interactions, decisions, and reflection. Tasks continued, blending practicality with habit, repairing worn gear, reorganizing rations, inspecting weapons, or attending to minor injuries. Every movement required precision, awareness, and adaptability, reminding soldiers that vigilance extended far beyond combat and into the minutiae of daily life. Meals retained their role as both sustenance and psychological anchor. Bread, boiled potatoes, thin slices of preserved meat, or the occasional rare treat like chocolate or sugar provided physical fuel, while coffee, brewed carefully over embers, carried warmth, aroma, and comfort. Sharing food or drink, passing morsels to a comrade, or dividing a rare treat became subtle acts of camaraderie, reinforcing social bonds, sustaining morale, and offering fleeting reprieve from the rigidity and strain of daily duties. Observation extended into every facet of life. Soldiers monitored terrain, weather, wildlife, and subtle environmental cues, but they also scrutinized their comrades. Expressions, gestures, and tone of voice conveyed fatigue, emotion, or intention, guiding decisions, coordination, and social interaction. Acts of quiet support, offering advice, lending tools, or simply acknowledging effort, reinforced cohesion, creating an invisible but essential network of trust. Awareness, both practical and emotional, became a constant companion, shaping decisions, perception, and the capacity to endure. Even within repetitive routines, moments of fascination and reflection appeared. The changing patterns of sunlight through trees, the ripple of water across a nearby stream, or the call of distant birds offered transient beauty, mental reprieve, and subtle engagement. Soldiers attuned themselves to these details, finding continuity and emotional sustenance in fleeting sensory experiences. Each observation, no matter how small, contributed to resilience, perception, and a quiet sense of humanity in the midst of regimented and demanding life. Letters, photographs, and small tokens from home held extraordinary significance. A slightly creased photograph could evoke vivid recollections of family, friends, and familiar landscapes, providing a brief psychological escape. Trinkets, notes, or charms were carefully preserved within clothing or personal gear, offering continuity, hope, and reassurance. Sharing these items with trusted comrades reinforced bonds, provided comfort, and sustained morale, reminding soldiers that connections with loved ones persisted despite physical and emotional distance. Rituals structured daily existence, blending practicality and symbolic meaning. Polishing boots, cleaning rifles, arranging personal belongings, or repeating habitual gestures were not merely tasks. They were acts of discipline, control, and subtle affirmation of identity. Superstitions, repeated phrases, or personal habits provided psychological stability, bridging the predictable and unpredictable, the controllable and the uncertain. These small, repeated acts reinforced structure, maintained morale, and preserved a sense of agency amidst the external constraints of military life. Social interactions, though often limited, played a vital role. Quiet conversation, storytelling, small games, and improvised music offered distraction, amusement, and reinforcement of cohesion. Humor, often ironic or dark, helped soldiers process fear and tension indirectly, while shared narratives blended imagination, observation, and memory, reinforcing collective identity and camaraderie. Even small gestures of attentiveness, cooperation, or reassurance subtly strengthened trust and social cohesion, creating a resilient framework essential to endurance and morale. Rest, though fragile, was crucial. Sleeping in tents, narrow bunks, or dugouts required adaptation to cold, dampness, insects, and the persistent need for vigilance. Brief periods of sleep demanded careful positioning, mental readiness, and a delicate balance between relaxation and alertness. Dreams, vivid yet fragmented, wove together memory, anxiety, and imagination, influencing emotional state, perception, and preparedness for upcoming tasks. Mastery of rest became an essential skill, complementing physical ability and tactical competence, and subtly shaping endurance, resilience, and psychological stability. Even ordinary observation offered depth. Light shifting across terrain, subtle sounds of wildlife, or distant movements provided moments of reflection, curiosity, and transient engagement. Soldiers cultivated awareness of these details, sustaining attention, mental resilience, and connection to the environment amidst repetitive routines. Life, regimented and demanding, persisted through these ephemeral observations, preserving perception, continuity, and a quiet assertion of humanity within military life. Adaptability remained ever-present. Minor disruptions, changes in weather, delayed supplies, emergent tasks, or interpersonal tension required immediate response. Soldiers improvised within constraints, balancing efficiency, duty, and personal comfort. Small adjustments, rearranging gear, modifying clothing, or altering routines, reinforced agency, resilience, and subtle mastery over circumstances largely beyond individual control, shaping both personal endurance and collective functionality. Night deepened over the camp, transforming familiar shapes into shadows and sounds into subtle signals. Soldiers moved with habitual care, performing essential tasks under the dim light of lanterns or small fires. Repairing torn fabric, adjusting straps, cleaning equipment, or preparing rations became acts of both necessity and quiet mindfulness. Even minor oversights, a poorly tightened belt, a misaligned weapon, or a dropped item, could ripple outward, affecting efficiency, comfort, or morale. The environment demanded constant awareness, a subtle balancing act between routine, vigilance, and adaptability. Meals continued to provide both sustenance and structure. Bread, thinly sliced preserved meats, boiled potatoes, or the occasional rare treat like sugar or chocolate were consumed with measured attention. Coffee, slowly brewed over embers, offered warmth and a comforting aroma, signaling brief moments of relief and fostering quiet connection. Sharing small morsels, passing a cup, or dividing a rare treat became understated acts of camaraderie, reinforcing social bonds and sustaining morale in ways that extended beyond words or orders. Observation remained an unbroken thread through daily life. Soldiers monitored terrain, weather, and wildlife, but equally they observed one another. Gestures, posture, and tone revealed subtle signs of fatigue, anxiety, or resolve, guiding social interaction, decision-making, and coordination. Acts of quiet support, sharing advice, lending tools, or acknowledging effort, reinforced cohesion and created an invisible network of trust that underpinned endurance. Awareness became both practical and psychological, shaping perception, choice, and the ability to navigate uncertainty. Even repetitive hours offered richness and subtle engagement. The flicker of firelight across tents, the distant ripple of a stream, or the soft call of nocturnal birds provided points of reflection and fleeting beauty. Soldiers cultivated attention to these minor details, finding continuity, mental relief, and subtle reinforcement of perception and resilience. Life persisted in these small observations, sustaining both engagement and a quiet assertion of humanity amidst rigid routines. Letters and personal mementos retained profound emotional weight. A worn photograph could evoke vivid memories of family, friends, or familiar landscapes, transporting a soldier beyond the immediate confines of duty. Charms, notes, or small keepsakes, carefully tucked into clothing or gear, provided continuity and reassurance. Sharing such items with trusted comrades strengthened bonds, offered comfort, and subtly sustained morale, reminding soldiers that meaningful connections endure despite distance, danger, and isolation. Rituals shaped daily life, blending practical necessity and symbolic meaning. Cleaning weapons, arranging personal items, polishing boots, and repeating habitual gestures became acts of discipline, subtle assertion of identity, and psychological anchoring. Superstitions, repeated phrases, or personal routines provided continuity and comfort, bridging the predictable with the unpredictable, the controllable with the uncertain. These small acts reinforced structure, preserved morale, and maintained a sense of agency within an environment dominated by external constraints. Social interaction, while limited, remained essential. Quiet conversations, storytelling, small games, and improvised music provided moments of connection, distraction, and cohesion. Humor, often ironic or dark, allowed soldiers to process stress and fear indirectly. Shared narratives combined memory, imagination, and observation, fostering collective identity and reinforcing camaraderie. Even minor gestures of attentiveness, cooperation, or reassurance subtly strengthened trust and cohesion, creating a resilient social framework critical for mental and physical endurance. Rest, though delicate, was vital. Sleeping in tents, bunks, or dugouts required careful management of cold, dampness, insects, and the need for vigilance. Even brief sleep demanded strategic positioning, mental readiness, and a balance between relaxation and alertness. Dreams were vivid, often fragmented, blending memory, anxiety, and imagination, influencing perception, emotional state, and readiness for future tasks. Mastery of rest became as crucial as any physical skill, shaping endurance, cognitive alertness, and psychological resilience. Even ordinary observation offered subtle richness. The shifting play of light, distant sounds, the scent of smoke, or the movement of wildlife provided reflection, curiosity, and mental engagement. Soldiers cultivated awareness of these small cues, sustaining perception, attention, and continuity amidst structured labor. Life, regimented and demanding, persisted in these fleeting observations, preserving perception, resilience, and a quiet assertion of humanity within the constraints of military life. Adaptability remained ever-present. Sudden weather shifts, delayed supplies, emergent tasks, or social tensions required immediate adjustment. Soldiers improvised within constraints, balancing efficiency, duty, and personal comfort. Even small adjustments, rearranging gear, modifying clothing, or altering routines, reinforced agency, resilience, and subtle mastery over circumstances largely beyond personal control, shaping both individual endurance and collective cohesion. Night deepened, enveloping the camp in shadows and soft, muted sounds that carried signals both subtle and significant. Soldiers moved cautiously, completing necessary tasks that required precision, observation, and quiet adaptability. Repairing gear, folding blankets, tending fires, or organizing rations were actions infused with purpose, as even minor oversights. A misaligned strap, a loose buckle, or an unattended ember could disrupt order, comfort, or morale. Each motion, while mundane, was intertwined with awareness, vigilance, and the subtle negotiation of routine and unpredictability. Meals, though simple, continued to anchor daily life. Bread, preserved meats, boiled potatoes, or occasional small treats like sugar or chocolate provided physical sustenance, while coffee, carefully brewed over embers, offered warmth, aroma, and psychological comfort. Sharing morsels or dividing coffee among comrades became understated acts of solidarity, subtly reinforcing trust, camaraderie, and morale. These small exchanges, repeated in countless variations, shaped both daily rhythm and emotional resilience, offering human connection amidst the structure of military life. Observation remained constant, encompassing both environmental and social awareness. Soldiers monitored terrain, weather, and wildlife for cues, while also reading subtle signals from each other. Posture, expression, tone, and gestures conveyed fatigue, resolve, or latent anxiety, guiding decisions and interactions. Acts of quiet support, offering advice, lending tools, or acknowledging effort, reinforced cohesion, creating a network of trust essential for endurance and efficiency. Awareness, both practical and psychological, became a pervasive, almost unconscious skill, shaping perception, decision-making, and social dynamics. Even routine hours offered fleeting fascination. The flicker of firelight on canvas, the ripple of water from a nearby stream, or the distant call of a nocturnal bird captured attention, providing mental respite and subtle sensory engagement. Soldiers trained themselves to notice these small details, deriving continuity, comfort, and mental stimulation. These observations, though ephemeral, contributed to resilience, perception, and a quiet assertion of humanity amidst the regimented, demanding life of the camp. Letters, photographs, and small personal tokens maintained extraordinary emotional significance. A worn photograph could transport a soldier to memories of family, friends, and familiar landscapes, offering brief mental escape. Charms, notes, or keepsakes, carefully stored in clothing or equipment, provided continuity, hope, and reassurance. Sharing such items with trusted comrades reinforced social bonds, provided emotional comfort, and subtly sustained morale, reminding soldiers that meaningful human connections persisted despite distance and isolation. Rituals structured both practical and psychological life. Cleaning rifles, polishing boots, arranging personal items, and repeating habitual gestures were not merely chores, they were acts of discipline, identity, and subtle control. Superstitions, repeated phrases, or personal habits offered continuity, bridging predictable routines with the unpredictable demands of the environment. These repeated acts reinforced structure, preserved morale, and fostered a sense of agency within conditions often dominated by external authority. Social interaction, though limited, remained central to endurance. Quiet conversations, shared stories, small games, or improvised music provided moments of connection, distraction, and cohesion. Humor, often ironic or dark, helped soldiers process fear and tension indirectly. Shared narratives fused observation, imagination, and memory, reinforcing collective identity and camaraderie. Even minor gestures of attentiveness, cooperation, or reassurance subtly strengthened trust and social cohesion, building a resilient framework crucial for psychological and physical endurance. Rest, though fragile, remained indispensable. Sleeping in tents, narrow bunks, or dugouts required careful adaptation to cold, dampness, insects, and the persistent need for vigilance. Even brief sleep demanded strategic positioning, mental readiness, and a careful balance between relaxation and alertness. Dreams, vivid yet fragmented, wove memory, anxiety, and imagination together, influencing perception, emotional state, and readiness for upcoming tasks. Mastery of rest, though delicate, became as critical as any physical or technical skill, shaping endurance, alertness, and psychological resilience. Even ordinary observation carried subtle richness. Changes in light, distant sounds, the movement of wildlife, or the faint scent of smoke offered reflection, curiosity, and sensory engagement. Soldiers cultivated awareness of these minor cues, sustaining attention, perception, and connection to the environment amidst structured and repetitive labor. Life, regimented and demanding, persisted in these ephemeral observations, preserving continuity, mental resilience, and a quiet assertion of humanity. Adaptability remained constant. Sudden changes, weather shifts, delayed supplies, emergent tasks, or interpersonal friction, required immediate response. Soldiers improvised solutions within constraints, balancing efficiency, duty, and personal comfort. Small adjustments, reorganizing gear, altering routines, or modifying clothing, reinforced agency, resilience, and subtle mastery over circumstances largely beyond direct control, shaping individual endurance and collective cohesion. The night air grew colder, carrying faint scents of damp earth, smoke, and distant vegetation, while shadows shifted across tents and equipment, creating a subtle interplay of light and perception that required constant awareness. Soldiers moved quietly through the camp, tending to small but essential tasks, repairing torn fabric, adjusting straps, checking supplies, and ensuring weapons were ready. Even minor oversights, a loose buckle, an uneven strap, or a forgotten tool, could disrupt efficiency, comfort, or morale. Each action, however mundane, demanded attention, precision, and an unspoken negotiation between routine and unpredictability, shaping both immediate outcomes and long-term resilience. Meals, though simple, remained vital anchors of daily life. Thin bread, preserved meats, boiled potatoes, and occasional treats such as chocolate or sugar cubes provided physical nourishment, while coffee, brewed carefully over embers or a small flame, offered warmth, aroma, and psychological comfort. Sharing small portions, dividing a cup of coffee, or passing morsels to a comrade became understated acts of solidarity, reinforcing trust, camaraderie, and morale, subtly reminding each soldier that human connections persisted despite the rigid structure of military life. Observation extended across all dimensions of daily existence. Soldiers watched terrain, weather, and wildlife for cues while simultaneously attending to the social landscape within the camp. Posture, tone, and gestures conveyed fatigue, determination, or unspoken anxiety, influencing decisions and coordination. Acts of quiet support, offering advice, lending tools, or acknowledging effort, strengthened cohesion, forming an invisible network of trust that underpinned endurance, efficiency, and social stability. Awareness became both instinctive and deliberate, shaping perception, choice, and psychological resilience. Even repetitive routines contained elements of fascination and subtle engagement. The flicker of firelight against canvas, the soft murmur of a stream, or the distant calls of nocturnal birds offered sensory relief and moments of reflection. Soldiers cultivated attention to these details, finding continuity, mental engagement, and subtle aesthetic satisfaction. These fleeting observations contributed to mental resilience, perception, and a quiet assertion of humanity amidst regimented and demanding routines, allowing men to maintain focus and emotional equilibrium. Letters, photographs, and personal tokens held extraordinary emotional weight. A worn photograph could evoke vivid memories of home, family, or familiar landscapes, transporting a soldier momentarily beyond the confines of duty. Charms, notes, or small mementos, carefully tucked into clothing or personal gear, provided continuity, hope, and reassurance. Sharing these items with trusted comrades reinforced social bonds, offered comfort, and subtly sustained morale, reminding soldiers that meaningful human connections endured despite distance, danger, and isolation. Rituals structured daily life, combining practicality with psychological significance. Polishing boots, cleaning rifles, arranging personal belongings, or repeating habitual gestures were acts of discipline, identity, and subtle self-assertion. Superstitions, repeated phrases, or personal habits offered comfort, bridging predictable routines with unpredictable circumstances. These repeated acts reinforced structure, preserved morale, and maintained a sense of control and agency within an environment often dominated by external demands. Social interaction, while limited, remained essential. Quiet conversations, storytelling, small games, and improvised music created opportunities for connection, distraction, and cohesion. Humor, often ironic or dark, allowed soldiers to process fear and tension indirectly. Shared narratives combined imagination, memory, and observation, reinforcing collective identity and camaraderie. Even minor gestures of attentiveness, cooperation, or reassurance subtly strengthened trust and social cohesion, forming a resilient framework necessary for mental and physical endurance. Rest, though fragile, remained indispensable. Sleeping in tents, narrow bunks, or dugouts required adaptation to cold, dampness, insects, and the persistent need for vigilance. Brief sleep demanded strategic positioning, mental readiness, and a careful balance between relaxation and alertness. Dreams, vivid yet fragmented, wove memory, anxiety, and imagination together, influencing perception, emotional state, and preparation for future tasks. Mastery of rest, fragile yet essential, complemented physical ability and tactical competence, shaping endurance, alertness, and psychological resilience. Even ordinary observation held subtle richness. Shifts in light, distant sounds, movement of wildlife, or the faint scent of smoke offered reflection, curiosity, and sensory engagement. Soldiers cultivated awareness of these minor details, sustaining focus, perception, and continuity amidst structured labor. Life, regimented and demanding, persisted in these ephemeral observations, preserving perception, resilience, and a quiet assertion of humanity within the constraints of military existence. Adaptability was a constant necessity. Sudden changes, weather shifts, delayed supplies, emergent tasks, or social friction, required immediate adjustment. Soldiers improvised solutions within constraints, balancing efficiency, duty, and personal comfort. Small adjustments, reorganizing gear, modifying routines, or altering clothing, reinforced agency, resilience, and subtle mastery over circumstances largely beyond direct control, shaping both individual endurance and collective cohesion. Dawn crept over the camp, soft light spilling across tents, weapons, and worn uniforms, transforming familiar spaces into subtle new patterns that demanded careful attention. Soldiers stirred with practiced rhythm, performing essential tasks with habitual precision, checking weapons, arranging gear, repairing fabric, or organizing rations. Each movement, no matter how mundane, carried weight, as even a small oversight, a misaligned strap, a loose buckle, or a dropped item, could ripple through efficiency, comfort, or morale. Life required constant negotiation between routine and uncertainty, vigilance and habituation, labor and fleeting moments of observation. Meals retained their central role, providing structure, sustenance, and subtle psychological relief. Bread, boiled potatoes, preserved meats, and occasional small treats such as chocolate or sugar cubes were consumed with quiet care. Coffee, slowly brewed over embers, offered warmth, aroma, and a brief sense of continuity. Sharing morsels, dividing coffee, or passing small treats became understated acts of camaraderie, reinforcing trust, connection, and morale, subtly reminding soldiers that human bonds persisted even under regimented conditions. Observation remained a pervasive thread, bridging environment, duty, and social dynamics. Soldiers monitored terrain, weather, and wildlife while reading subtle signals in their comrades' posture, tone, and gestures. Fatigue, resolve, or unspoken anxiety could be discerned through small cues, guiding decisions, coordination, and interaction. Acts of quiet support, offering advice, lending tools, or acknowledging effort, strengthened cohesion and built an invisible network of trust essential for endurance. Awareness, both practical and psychological, shaped perception, choice, and social stability, functioning as a constant companion through repetitive and demanding routines. Even repetitive hours contained opportunities for subtle engagement. The interplay of light through leaves, the distant murmur of a stream, or the nocturnal calls of birds offered fleeting fascination, reflection, and mental respite. Soldiers trained themselves to notice these details, preserving continuity, perception, and quiet mental stimulation. These ephemeral observations sustained resilience and a faint but persistent sense of humanity amid structured labor, monotony, and environmental unpredictability. Letters, photographs, and personal keepsakes remained powerful emotional anchors. A worn photograph could evoke vivid memories of family, friends, or familiar landscapes, providing brief mental escape and comfort. Charms, notes, or small mementos tucked into clothing or personal gear offered continuity, reassurance, and psychological stability. Sharing such items with trusted comrades reinforced social bonds, offered solace, and subtly sustained morale, reminding soldiers that meaningful human connections endured despite isolation, danger, and routine. Rituals, blending practicality and psychological grounding, structured daily existence. Polishing boots, cleaning rifles, arranging personal items, and repeating habitual gestures were acts of discipline, identity, and subtle self-assertion. Superstitions, repeated phrases, or personal habits provided psychological comfort, bridging predictable routines with unpredictable challenges. These acts reinforced structure, preserved morale, and fostered a sense of agency within conditions often dominated by external control. Social interaction, though limited, remained vital for psychological endurance. Quiet conversations, storytelling, small games, and improvised music created shared experiences, distraction, and subtle reinforcement of cohesion. Humor, often ironic or dark, enabled soldiers to process fear and tension indirectly. Shared narratives blended memory, imagination, and observation, strengthening collective identity and camaraderie. Even minor gestures of attentiveness, cooperation, or reassurance subtly reinforced trust and social cohesion, sustaining a resilient social framework essential for mental and physical resilience. Rest remained fragile yet indispensable. Sleeping in tents, narrow bunks, or dugouts required adaptation to cold, dampness, insects, and the ongoing need for vigilance. Brief sleep demanded strategic positioning, alertness, and careful balancing of relaxation and awareness. Dreams, vivid and fragmented, interwove memory, anxiety, and imagination, influencing perception, emotional state, and readiness for future tasks. Mastery of rest complemented physical skill, endurance, and tactical preparedness, subtly shaping resilience and psychological equilibrium. Even ordinary observation carried richness. Shifting light, distant sounds, movement of wildlife, or faint smoke offered points of reflection, curiosity, and engagement. Soldiers cultivated attention to these small cues, sustaining perception, focus, and continuity amidst structured labor. Life persisted in these ephemeral observations, preserving perception, resilience, and a quiet assertion of humanity within the constraints of military existence. Adaptability remained ever-present. Sudden changes, weather shifts, delayed supplies, emergent tasks, or social friction, required immediate adjustment. Soldiers improvised within constraints, balancing efficiency, duty, and personal comfort. Small adjustments, rearranging gear, altering routines, or modifying clothing, reinforced agency, resilience, and subtle mastery over circumstances largely beyond personal control, shaping both individual endurance and collective cohesion.